the footage on the screen before I sat down. I noticed that before I noticed anything else about the room. Before the 6 Alliance officers, arranged in a shallow arc behind their slate-gray briefing table, before the recording equipment on the back wall with its blinking amber status, light, before the karath-venn xenobiologist sitting apart from the officers in a seat that had been pulled slightly out of the arc, as though he hadn't quite committed to joining the military side of things. I noticed the footage because it was already running, and it was footage I recognized. Wreckage, a corridor section from a Vithali-class forward installation, or what had been one, before it stopped resembling anything engineered. The composite paneling had peeled away from the interior framing and overlapping sheets, like the hull of something that had been squeezed. Emergency lighting had kicked in at a frequency that strobed faintly on the recording, giving the dust and the smoke and the falling particulate a greenish underwater quality. In the lower left quadrant of the frame, half occluded by debris, you could just make out a boot. Tactical tread, human manufacture, that was my boot. I pulled out the chair across from the senior officer. Tactical Assessor First Grade, Veth Orvath, according to the nameplate on the table, and sat down without being asked. 14 years in the Terran Expeditionary Ground Force teaches you not to wait for an invitation to sit. It also teaches you to read a room before you say a word. And what this room told me immediately was that the 6 officers wanted answers. The xenobiologist wanted something else entirely, and nobody in it had any idea how to begin. I helped them out. You want to know about the 6 minutes, I said. So do I, honestly. I've been trying to reconstruct it since extraction day 12. Parts of it, I remember clearly. Parts of it, I apparently did without remembering, which is its own kind of unsettling. Veth Orvath's translation bead processed, and the narrow secondary pupils behind his primary set contracted slightly, the karath-venn equivalent of a raised eyebrow. You don't remember what you did. I remember the goal. I remember the constraints. I remember the outcomes. The middle part, the actual decisions, the actual sequence, that's patchier than I'd like it to be, is probably why your footage exists and why you've asked me here. On the screen, the boot moved. The person it belonged to, me, 14 months ago. Inside a structure that had already announced its intention to kill me via termination sequence, display I couldn't read, hauled herself upright against a section of framing that had bent inward at roughly 60 degrees from vertical. I watched myself do this without any particular emotional response. Field footage of yourself is strange. It's like watching someone else who happens to have borrowed your body. The karath-venn xenobiologist, his nameplate read Sovelkern, Research Division, Interspecies Behavioral and Adaptive Sciences, leaned slightly forward. He had a recording tablet on his knee and hadn't used it yet. He was watching me watch the footage. I noticed that too. "Don't you walk us through what you were working with," said the officer to Veth Orvath's left. "Sethov Goral, Operations Assessment. 1 grade below." His tone was carefully neutral in the way that means someone has already formed a strong opinion and is trying not to lead the witness. At the time of entry into the installation, what your unit had, what you'd lost, what the situation was. I folded my hands on the table. On the screen behind me, which I didn't need to look at because I'd already watched the full 6 minutes 4 times in the holding suite they'd given me. 2 days prior, I was doing something with a length of conduit housing that had been partially sheared away from the wall. My unit was Sergeant Davin Okoro, Corporal Te Erasmus, and Private First Class Ren Soletti, I said. 12-minute assault on the Vethali installation with the objective of disabling the relay cluster on sublevel 2. We expected light resistance, standard fortification, standard layout. What we found was a structure that had already taken significant damage from an earlier air engagement we hadn't been informed about. The briefing was running 14 hours old by the time we made entry. The interior was partially collapsed. The relay cluster was still intact. The self-destruct sequence on the installation had been triggered, presumably by whoever was supposed to be defending it. "What was your comm status at that point?" Sovelkern asked. His voice was quieter than the officers, more deliberate. "Gone." Okoro's set took shrapnel on the approach. Rasmus's set was functioning but couldn't reach anyone through the structure's interference. We were sealed in a partially collapsed Vethali installation. with a countdown we couldn't read, in a layout that didn't match our maps, with one working rifle between 4 of us and a relay cluster that was still, technically, our objective. And your doctrine in that situation? Veth said. Standard doctrine is to mark the structure. Extract immediately report coordinates for a follow-on engagement. We had 4 points of entry confirmed on our approach, 2 of which were now blocked by collapse. One of the remaining 2 was accessible but exited into a kill corridor. We'd taken fire from it on the way in. The 4th was the one we'd used, and by the time the countdown started, it had also partially collapsed. So standard doctrine was available to us only in the sense that any option you cannot actually execute is technically still on the table. Soval Kern wrote something on his tablet. Veth looked at him, then back at me. So you chose to remain. I chose to solve the problem that was in front of me, which was, Christ, we were inside a structure that was going to kill us in an unknown number of minutes. We had one viable exit that required either clearing rubble or bypassing a blast door we hadn't come in through, and we had a relay cluster 12 meters away that we could still disable if someone wanted to take the time. Didn't think of it as choosing to remain. I thought of it as choosing to work. The officer at the far left of the arc, the xenobiologist side, was Orath Dim, listed as Senior Analysis, Behavioral Sciences Liaison. He'd been the quietest one so far, and he spoke now for the first time. In the footage, he said, you can be observed beginning to disassemble a section of the wall conduit housing within approximately 8 seconds of the countdown display. Activating. That's a very fast response to a situation you describe as novel and unplanned. It's a fast response to a situation where every second I spend not responding is a second the countdown advances. I don't know what the countdown was counting down from. I couldn't read the display. All I knew was that it was decreasing. Fast responses to decreasing countdowns are fairly basic survival arithmetic. Yes, Orath Dim said. What were you doing with the conduit housing? On the screen, I was doing something quite specific with a length of conduit housing. I had peeled back the housing from a section of wall, exposed the interior. A braided power transfer bundle used in Vethali systems to distribute charge from the installation's backup cell array to secondary systems. And I was separating 3 of the inner leads from the bundle with my field knife while simultaneously working a fusing cap off the end of the nearest lead with my thumb. This was not something I had been trained to do with a Vethali power transfer bundle. I had never seen a Vethali power transfer bundle before I entered that installation. I had never, prior to that moment, given any thought whatsoever to how one might be used as a directional charge initiator. I considered how to explain this. There was a section of the blast door's lower track assembly that had buckled inward during the earlier structural damage. I said, track assembly is what the door rides on. If the track is bent inward, the door can't retract. If the door can't retract, it's held closed by friction and compression, not by its own locking mechanism, because the locking mechanism can't engage properly when the track is deformed. Which means you don't need to break the lock. You need to break the track. You observed all of this. Sethavgorel started in about 4 seconds, yes. I'm not saying I drew up a schematic. I'm saying I looked at the door and understood the geometry of why it was stuck and therefore what it would take to unstick it. Deforming a section of track that is already bent, hitting it from the other side, in the right place, enough force, will sometimes cause the material to crack at the stress point rather than bend further. If it cracks, the door can be levered through the broken section, not elegantly, but through, and the conduit bundle, Soval Kern said quietly. Vethali power transfer bundles are designed to carry charge from the backup cell array to secondary systems. The backup cell arrays in forward installations are rated at significantly higher voltage than the secondary systems actually need, because you want overhead for surge conditions. There's a lot of charge in that bundle, and most of it's being bled off by the system architecture. If you break the internal regulation on the bundle, which the fusing cap manages, and you direct the leads to a specific point, you can induce a rapid discharge. An explosion, Veth said. A controlled one, small, targeted at the stress point in the track assembly. Yes. There was a silence in the room. On the screen, I watched myself finish separating the leads and begin working out how to affix them to the track assembly in a way that would direct the discharge correctly. I was using a strip of adhesive emergency seal from my medkit to hold the leads in place. The adhesive seals are rated to bond to most metallic surfaces under field conditions, and I was doing it one-handed because with my other hand I was holding a section of framing that had partially fallen across the corridor and would have swung into Soletti if I'd let it go. Sovalkern wrote something on his tablet. A long something. He underlined it. "I want to make sure I understand the sequence," he said. "In approximately 22 seconds after the countdown initiated, you had identified a non-standard exit, diagnosed the mechanical failure, preventing its use, identified a power source within the environment capable of inducing a solution, understood the internal architecture of that power source well enough to bypass its regulation, and begun the physical process of constructing an improvisational charge device, using components you had never used before from a system you had never encountered before." That's accurate. Had you trained for any component of this? Not specifically. I had general training in power system improvisation. That's standard in advanced combat engineering, which I did in year 6. I'd used directional charge techniques before with human-manufactured components. I had basic familiarity with the concept of backup cell arrays from cross-training material on captured installation types. None of that training covered Vithali systems specifically, but you applied it. I applied the underlying logic of it. The specific components were different. The logic. Voltage wants to go somewhere. Regulation is what prevents it from going everywhere at once. Remove the regulation and direct the leads. Is the same regardless of who manufactured the conduit. Sovalkern looked down at his tablet and then up at me with an expression I'd learned to read over the 2 days he'd been interviewing me. It wasn't the clinical distance look of the officers, whose version of alarm presented as studied neutrality. His was something else. Something that had been building incrementally since the first conversation. And that was, if I had to name it, closest to the look of a researcher who has been tracking a variable for a long time, and has just seen it exceed every projection he had made for it. "Gunnery Sergeant Meisel," he said. "How many times in your career have you done something like this?" I thought about it honestly. "Define like this," I said. "Applied prior knowledge from one domain to solve a novel problem in a different domain, under significant time pressure, using materials or methods you had not specifically trained on, successfully." I thought about it longer. "Couldn't give you a count," I said. "It's not something I've tracked. It's just the job. When the situation changes, you work with what's there. What's there is never exactly what the manual assumes will be there, so you adapt. Every time. Every time I needed to." "Yes." Orith Dim made a small sound. Not a word, something involuntary, quickly suppressed. The officers nearest him glanced over. "Sergeant," he said. And his voice had taken on a careful quality the way a person's voice gets. When they're asking a question they expect to have a specific answer to and are trying not to reveal which answer they're hoping for. "Are you exceptional at this, among your species?" I looked at him. "No," I said. "I'm good at it. But every soldier I've served with can do some version of what I did in that installation. The ones who've been in longer are better at it. The ones in special operations are significantly better at it. What I did in there was, I don't want to overclaim this, competent. It worked. It wasn't elegant. Okoro would have done it faster. Rasmus would have found a cleaner solution. I was the senior person in the room, so it was my call, and I made it work." Veth Orvath's secondary pupils contracted again further this time and held. "You're saying this capacity is standard," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Among military personnel, it's trained and refined. But the underlying capacity, yes. It's not special. Every human does some version of this. We have a word for it. We call it improvising or adapting or problem solving, depending on the context. But it all comes from the same place. You encounter a situation the plan didn't account for. You take stock of what you have. You construct the best available solution from those components. You execute. This is not a remarkable skill. It is the basic skill. Everything else is built on top of it." The room was quiet for a moment. On the screen there was a flash, the discharge, and controlled. Exactly where I'd placed the leads. The lower section of the track assembly fractured at the stress point. The blast door shuddered, held for 2 seconds, and then Okoro hit the base of it with his shoulder and the bottom edge swung outward through the track section. Not a door anymore, more of a flap, but big enough we went through. The timestamp in the corner of the footage read 22 seconds from the moment the countdown had started. Sovol Kern had stopped writing. His tablet was on his knee, and his attention was entirely on me. And the expression on his face was the one that had been ceasing build for 2 days. The one that, I was starting to understand, had nothing to do with the blast door, or the conduit bundle, or the 6 minutes of footage. Those were just the entry point. The thing he was actually investigating was older and larger and had started well before my unit made entry into that installation. "I'd like to explain something to the room," he said. It wasn't directed at me specifically. He was talking to the officers. Orvath, with the slight incline of his head that the translation brief had told me indicated deference to seniority, gave him the floor. Sovol Kern stood. He didn't need to stand. The room was small enough that everyone could hear him perfectly well from his chair. But he stood, anyway, the way a person does when they've been sitting with a conclusion for a long time. And standing up is the physical expression of finally releasing it. The Karath-venn Alliance has engaged Terran forces in 7 documented ground engagements over the past 4 years, he said. In each of those engagements, post-action analysis has noted what my division has been cataloging under a provisional heading, Field Response, Anomalies. This category was created to contain a specific type of observation, instances where Terran personnel, facing conditions that should have resulted in mission failure, instead achieved mission objectives or survival outcomes by methods not present in any tactical doctrine we had been able to obtain or infer. The officers were paying careful attention. This was not new material to Sovol Kern's superiors, I guessed. Not entirely. But the way he was framing it suggested that what he was about to say next was the part that hadn't been formally presented before. The working assumption within my division, he continued, was that these anomalies represented highly trained specialist behavior, that the Terran military was deploying personnel with specific improvisational training in forward positions as a strategic asset, a specialized capability concentrated in certain individuals. We were looking for the training program. He paused. We didn't find one. Not in the way we were looking for it. What we found instead, what the interviews with Gunnery Sergeant Meisel have confirmed, in combination with the pattern data from the 7 prior engagements, is that there is no specialist program. There is no trained cohort of improvisation specialists. What we have been categorizing as anomalies are simply human beings doing what human beings do. He set his tablet down on his own seat and turned slightly so he could address both the officers and me at the same time. Every species the Alliance has worked with, including our own, has what my colleagues call a protocol floor. When a situation exceeds the plan, an individual will attempt to apply the nearest applicable protocol. If no applicable protocol exists, the individual experiences a decision latency gap. The duration of that gap varies by species and by training, but the gap itself is universal. It is the time required to recognize that existing solutions do not fit the novel problem, to disengage from the failed approach, and to begin constructing an alternative. He paused again, and I had the sense he was choosing the next words carefully. Humans do not appear to have a protocol floor in the same sense. When the plan fails, when the situation is genuinely novel, when the applicable protocol is absent or unusable, there is no latency gap. There is an immediate pivot to construction. The individual assesses available components, applies underlying logic from disparate prior experiences, and begins building a solution. Not the correct solution, not a guaranteed solution, a working hypothesis assembled from available parts, tested in real time, modified as needed. Process is not an exception to human cognition. It is the default mode of human cognition encountering a novel problem. Orvath was very still. The officer at the far right of the arc, the most junior one, whose nameplate I hadn't been able to read, had stopped pretending to take notes and was simply listening. The protocol floor, Sovol Kern continued, exists in other species because the alternative is noise. Without a structured response to novel situations, An individual who improvises constantly will generate chaotic, inconsistent, often contradictory behavior under pressure. Protocol floor is a feature, not a limitation. It filters out noise. It ensures that under stress, individuals respond predictably, in ways that can be coordinated with unit behavior, with doctrine, with command expectations. He looked at me then. Humans appear to have solved the noise problem differently. The improvisational pivot is not random. It is structured by underlying logic that the individual applies across domains. Gunnery Sergeant Meisel had never worked with a Vethali power transfer bundle. She had never designed a charge initiator from field-stripped components in an alien installation, but she had internalized the underlying logic of voltage, of discharge, of mechanical stress and fracture points, well enough that the unfamiliar components became transparent. She looked through them to the problem geometry beneath, and unlocked a solution, architecture that she had never assembled in that specific form, but had assembled, in various forms, across 14 years of fieldwork. He sat back down, picked up his tablet, set it down again without writing anything. The training the Alliance has been looking for, he said, is not a program. It is an accumulated library of underlying logic that every human being builds continuously, throughout their entire life, by encountering novel situations and constructing solutions to them. By the time a human reaches military service, they have been doing this for 18 or more years. By the time they reach 14 years of field service, the library is deep enough that very few situations they encounter will be genuinely without precedent at the level of underlying logic. The specifics may be new, the geometry never is. Veth Orvath was quiet for a long moment. How consistent is this, he said finally. Across the population? It is the baseline, Sovelkern said. It varies in quality and speed, age, experience, exposure to novel situations. All of these affect it. But we have not identified a human population that lacks it. Every human individual we have observed, in every context, engages in continuous environmental problem construction as a background cognitive process. The military personnel are not a special case. They are simply people for whom this process has been running at high intensity, under high stakes, very long time. Sethov Goral leaned forward. So when we're in the field against them, every individual you encounter is running a continuous assessment of the operational environment, the available resources, the constraints, and the failure modes of the current approach, Sovelkern said, at all times, without being asked to. Without being aware particularly that they're doing it. Gunnery Sergeant Meisel described this process as just the job. I have spoken to 6 other Terran personnel in the past year, and they have all used equivalent language, adapting, working with what's there, figuring it out. None of them identifies it as a skill. They identify it as a condition, something that simply occurs. I had been listening to all of this with the kind of attention I usually reserved for intelligence briefings, quietly, without expression, filing things as they arrived. Now I said something. Can I ask a question? Veth Orvath indicated I could. How long has the Alliance been in contact with Terran forces? Not the formal engagement record, the initial contact period. The first observations. There was a brief pause. Veth Orvath and Orithdim exchanged a look. 61 years, Orithdim said. I nodded. And in 61 years, you've been watching this and classifying it as anomalous. We have been attempting to understand it, Sovelkern said carefully. You've been looking for a training program, I said. Because if it's a training program, it has limits. It applies to a cohort. It can be countered, isolated, or accounted for in operational planning. If it's not a training program, I stopped. I wasn't trying to be provocative, but the implication was sitting in the room fully visible to everyone in it. And sometimes, the most useful thing you can do is let it breathe. Sovelkern looked at me steadily. If it is not a training program, then it is a species-level characteristic that applies to every human individual, in every context and planning's assumptions built on the premise that known tactics will produce known outcomes against human opponents require fundamental revision. Yes, I said, that's where I was going. The room was quiet again. On the screen, the footage had ended some time during Sovelkern's explanation, and someone had not bothered to stop it, so it had cycled back to the beginning and was running again from the top. The dust-filled corridor, The strobing green emergency light, boot half visible under the debris. My boot. Me, 14 months ago, in the first second before I stood up and started working. Veth Orveth straightened a folder on the table in front of him. And I had the sense this was something he did when he needed a moment before speaking. Soval Kern, he said. Walk us through the 7 engagement pattern, the full summary. I want the room to have it formally. Soval Kern opened his tablet, and for the first time since we'd sat down, he was reading from prepared material, rather than speaking from memory. Engagement 1, Vethali Orbital Platform 7, Year 1 of Contact, Second Quarter. Terran boarding party of 11, opposed by 43 defenders. The boarding party's primary breach tool failed on entry. Atmospheric pressure differential they hadn't been on. They improvised a bypass using the platform's own docking clamp mechanism, which they had studied for approximately 90 seconds, via external sensor imaging on the approach. The breach took 14 minutes instead of the planned 4. All 11 personnel made the objective. 41 of the 43 defenders were either neutralized or withdrew. The docking clamp mechanism, Seth of Goral said. They had training on it? They had 90 seconds of sensor imaging, from the outside, inverted, under approach conditions. Soval Kern looked up briefly, then back at his tablet. The analysis team's note in the original post-action file reads, and I am quoting the original file, methodology unclear, possibly specialist training we have not identified. That was the first time that phrase appeared in our records. It would appear 48 more times across the next 7 engagements. He scrolled. Engagement 3, Ground Operation, Kelvar Contestadon Zone. A 6-person Terran unit was cut off from their primary extraction route when a bridge structure partially collapsed under heavy vehicle traffic. Unrelated to the engagement, they were carrying 2 casualties who could not walk and had approximately 4 minutes before a flanking force closed their position. The unit's medic, the lowest-ranking person present, a specialist 2 grades below field qualified, improvised a load-bearing evacuation rig using the unit's standard-issue communications cable, 3 lengths of personal equipment webbing, and the structural framing of a collapsed field shelter that happened to be at the site. The rig supported both casualties and the 6 ambulatory personnel, crossing the compromised structure in 2 trips in 3 minutes and 40 seconds. The medic, Orth Dim said, was 22 years old, had been in field service for 19 months, and, when interviewed for this file 12 months later, said, I am quoting, I've done some version of that rig at least a dozen times in training, not with exactly those materials. But the geometry is always the same. You're distributing load across available connection points. Materials are just what's there. He set the tablet down. The geometry is always the same, he said, those words. 18 months of field service, 22 years of age, no specialist training, 2 casualties and 4 minutes before a flanking force. The geometry is always the same. Nobody said anything. One more, he said, and picked the tablet back up. Engagement 5. Because it is the most instructive for this room specifically. He scrolled. A Terran intelligence team of 3 was operating inside a communications relay node. An unmanned facility, our installation. When a security sweep patrol arrived 14 minutes ahead of the scheduled window. Their cover was compromised. Standard extraction protocols were blocked. The patrol was between them and every viable exit. The team had one option, remain hidden and hope the patrol completed its sweep without discovering them. That option had a low probability of success given the duration of the patrol. He paused to let that register, then continued. What the team did instead was trigger a false diagnostic alert in the facility's environmental monitoring system. By introducing a minor humidity variance in one of the server rooms, they used water from their field filtration units. The alert called the patrol to the server room the team had already vacated. The patrol spent 11 minutes investigating and clearing a room with no one in it. The team used those 11 minutes to access, copy, and transmit the relay node's full communications archive, reset the environmental monitoring system so no alert trace remained in the logs, and extract through the maintenance corridor the patrol had come in from. Sethov Goral was very still. They used the patrol, he said. They used the facility. The patrol was a resource the facility provided. The communications archive was the objective. The maintenance corridor was the exit. All three of those things were present in the environment. The team worked with what was there. Soval Kern looked at me. Gunnery Sergeant, does that process sound familiar to you? It sounds like a well-executed improvisation, I said. It does. The analysis team's note in the engagement file reads, and I will note this is the 47th instance of this phrase in our records. Methodology unclear. Possibly specialist training we have not identified. He set the tablet down again, with a deliberateness that read as the formal closing of an argument. 47 times, 47 engagements, 47 teams, 47 individuals, or small groups working with what was in front of them and achieving outcomes the plan didn't account for. 47 times we wrote specialist training and went looking for the program. Orith Dim said quietly, and it was never specialist training. Soval Kern confirmed. It was human people doing what human people do. He looked at me again, and this time it was the look of a researcher who wants to follow a line of inquiry that the formal record doesn't quite accommodate. Gunnery Sergeant, he said, can you tell me about a time before the Vithali installation, before this engagement, when you did something like this for the first time? The first time you remember clearly encountering a situation the plan didn't account for and constructing a solution from what was available. Looked at him. You want a personal history of the thing. I want to understand when it starts, whether it develops or whether it arrives. Thought about it. There were several candidates. I chose the clearest one because clarity serves accuracy, and accuracy was what the room needed. I was 19, I said. Not on the military yet. I was working a construction contract in a building project on the outskirts of Durban. Concrete pour went wrong mix ratio, bad weather. The pour started to separate before it set. If it fully separated in the form, it would have to be stripped and redone, which would have cost the project 2 weeks, and a significant sum of money. The site foreman was off-site. Pour supervisor was yelling at the concrete supplier. Nobody was doing anything useful. I could see Soval Kern's stylus moving. There was a plasticizer additive in the site storage, a chemical that changes the workability of concrete mixes. I had never used it. I had read about it in a materials handbook a month earlier because we'd had downtime, and I had run out of other things to read. I didn't know the correct dosage for the scale we were working with. I did know the underlying chemistry, what the plasticizer does to the cement matrix, how it reestablishes workability by interfering with particle clustering. I calculated a rough dosage from first principles because the handbook had given me enough to work backwards from, found the additive, mixed it in manually while the pour was still in the form, did through by hand with one of the site tools. The pour set correctly. The project stayed on schedule. You were 19, Soval Kern said. I was 19. I had read one handbook. I had never done anything like it before. The geometry was the same as every other chemistry problem I had ever done in school, and the stakes were just a concrete pour, so I didn't think of it as particularly dramatic. I thought of it as the thing to do while the adults were busy yelling at each other. Soval Kern underlined something, underlined it twice, and after that, he said, after that it was just the pattern, new environment, new problem, work out what the components are and what the underlying logic is, and build something that functions. The military made the environments more complex, and the problems more consequential, and the timelines shorter. The basic process was exactly what it was when I was 19 and reading handbook material out of boredom. Out of boredom, Orith Dim said. Out of boredom, I confirmed. I had run out of other things to read. He looked at Soval Kern. Soval Kern looked at me. The expression had settled into something I recognized now. Not the building alarm of the first 2 days, but its final form. The calm, settled look of a conclusion reached and accepted, and no longer requiring adjustment. I could present all 7, he said, resuming, but I think the pattern is established. In each case, a Terran unit or individual encountered a situation that deviated from the plan in a novel and significant way. In each case, the response was not delay, not failure, not a request for guidance or a fallback to an approximating protocol. The response was immediate reanalysis and construction. And in each case, When we interviewed the personnel afterward, they described the process as unremarkable, natural, expected. It's what you do when the plan breaks. Variations on that phrase appear in 5 of the 7 post-action interviews. Veth looked at the screen, which was still cycling through the corridor footage, still showing the green-lit wreckage at the beginning of the loop. He looked at it for a while. What broke the plan in each case, he said, was something we introduced. Collapsed bridges, pressure differentials, structural damage that wasn't in the briefing. In 6 of the 7 cases, the complicating factor was an environmental variable we either created or failed to disclose. Yes, Kern said. And in each case, the human response was to incorporate the complicating factor as a new resource. A pause, also yes. In 4 of the 7 cases, the thing that broke the plan became, in some form, part of the solution. The compromised bridge structure became the evacuation rig's anchor points. Pressure differential that defeated the primary breach tool was used to seal a defensive position during the extraction. The installation's self-destruct system, which is what we are watching on this screen, provided the charge that opened the exit. He looked at me then. Not at the officers. At me. The species that cannot be denied resources, he said quietly. Every obstacle is a potential resource. I considered not responding to that. Then I did. I've never heard it described that way. It's not wrong. I know, Kern said. That's the problem. The room was quiet for a long time after that. The longest silence of debrief, long enough that the footage on the screen completed another full cycle and started again. The corridor, the light, the boot. Orath Dim was looking at the table. Seth Goral was looking at the screen. The junior officer at the far end had his hands flat on the table in front of him, the posture of someone anchoring themselves to something solid. Veth broke the silence. Gunnery Sergeant. We have several specific technical questions about the installation engagement. The relay cluster was disabled, I said. That was the other thing I did in the 6 minutes. While Oker was working the door and Rasmus was getting Soletti's kit organized for extraction. Soletti had a compound fracture in his left forearm, the entry collapse. He was functional but needed support. I went to the relay cluster. 12 meters. I had the one working rifle. Relay cluster's housing had already been partially damaged by the earlier air engagement. Field stripped the housing the rest of the way. 12 seconds. Identified the primary transmission array, put a round through it, a second round through the backup feed, and rejoined the unit at the door. A pause. The mission objective, I added, was still the mission objective. The installation trying to kill us didn't change that. Seth Goral was looking at me with an expression that was harder to read than the others. Not alarm, exactly. Something more like a person recalibrating a measurement they have taken many times, and discovering the instrument was misread. You completed the objective, he said, in the same 6 minutes, while constructing the exit device and managing your unit. Yes. You did not mention this at the beginning of your account. You asked about the 6 minutes. I was telling you about the 6 minutes. The relay cluster was part of the 6 minutes. It would have been, he said carefully, the primary focus of our inquiry had we known. I considered this. I suppose I have a different sense of priority. The relay cluster was the job. Everything else was the problem that was preventing us from completing the job, and then getting out. The job got done. That part seemed settled. Kern had put down his tablet again. Gunnery Sergeant, he said. I want to return to one thing you said earlier. You said that when you described this capacity as baseline, you meant that every human can do some version of it, and the military-trained ones are better at it, and the special operations personnel are significantly better at it. Yes. What does significantly better mean? Specifically, when you try to describe it. I thought about this carefully, because it was an honest question deserving an honest answer. The limiting factor in improvisation is the library, I said. The collection of underlying logic you can draw on when the components in front of you are unfamiliar. The more domains you've worked in, the more situations you've encountered and solved, the deeper and more cross-referenced the library becomes. Special operations selection is, among other things, a filter for people whose libraries are unusually large and unusually well organized. People who have been solving problems, across a broad range of domains for a long time, and who can retrieve and apply that logic quickly under high stress? How quickly? Thought about it. I know operators who could have done what I did in that installation in about 8 seconds, I said. Not because they'd trained on Vethali transfer bundles specifically. Because the library is deep enough, and the retrieval is fast enough, and the stress response is integrated enough, that the time between problem identified and solution architecture initiated is very short, approaching a reflex almost. But it's not a reflex, it's reasoning, very fast reasoning. 8 seconds, Vethorvath said, approximately, in someone with 10+ years of special operations experience, in high-stress novel environment conditions. The officers at the end of the arc were not writing notes anymore. 2 of them were looking at the screen, which had cycled again and was back at the beginning of the footage, the corridor, the green light, the boot, with an expression that I recognized because I had seen it a few times over the course of a career. It was the expression of someone who has been thinking of a problem in a particular way for a long time, and has just seen the frame shift underneath them and has not yet finished falling. Solkern, by contrast, looked like someone who had been watching the frame shift slowly for a while, and was now simply watching the people in the room catch up. I'd like to enter one more observation into the record, he said, addressing Vethorvath, for the formal assessment. Proceed. Gunnery Sergeant Maisel has, over the course of this debrief, described the improvisation process as standard, as the baseline cognitive mode, as unremarkable, as just the job. She has consistently minimized its significance, not dishonestly, I believe, but accurately, from her own point of view. From her own point of view, nothing she did in that installation was exceptional. It was problem solving. It was the thing you do when the plan breaks. It is the thing she has always done. It is the thing everyone she knows does. He looked at me. The careful had shifted slightly. Not to warmth exactly, but to something that acknowledged a shared clarity. The reason this assessment exists, he said. The reason this debrief is happening. The reason the Alliance has spent 61 years trying to understand what it is we are observing in the field, is that from our point of view, Gunnery Sergeant Maisel walked into an unfamiliar alien installation, encountered an unanticipated structural collapse, lost comms, watched the environment announce its intention to kill her, and responded by casually disassembling a piece of the wall, correctly diagnosing the power architecture of a system she had never encountered, constructing an improvisational charge device in 22 seconds, blowing open a blast door, completing her mission objective in the same window, extracting her unit, and she describes this as unremarkable. He paused. From her point of view, it is unremarkable. That is precisely the point. It is not a feat. It is not an achievement. It is not even a story she had thought to tell in detail before we asked. It is Tuesday. It is the thing that happened that day. The installation broke, so she fixed it. That is what you do. He picked up his tablet and held it in both hands, not writing, just holding it. The Alliance has been looking for the training program that produces this, he said. The answer is that the training program is life. Every human child, from the first moments of problem-solving cognition, is building the library. Every novel situation they encounter, and they seek out novel situations, this is documented and consistent across the species. Humans are drawn to difficulty and complexity in a way that is, to put it plainly, not normal, adds to it. By the time a human being reaches military service age, the library contains 18 to 20+ years of continuous cross-domain problem solving. By the time they have 14 years of field experience, the library is deep enough, and the retrieval fast enough, that situations we would classify as mission-critical emergencies are, from their perspective, just the next problem. Vethorvath was quiet for a long time. Then he said slowly, and with the flat precision of a person entering something into the record, "So there is no ceiling." "Not that we have been able to identify," Solkern said. "The library grows, the retrieval gets faster, the stress integration improves. A 40-year veteran of human special operations, in a novel environment, under high-stress conditions, is not a less capable improviser than a 20-year-old novice. They are a significantly more capable one. The capacity does not degrade with use. It expands." Vethorvath looked down at the table, then up at me. Gunnery Sergeant, he said. Is there anything you want to add? I thought about it. Only one thing, I said, which is, and I mean this without any particular intention behind it, you should know that the operators I was comparing myself unfavorably to earlier, the ones who could probably do what I did in 8 seconds instead of 22. Most of them are younger than me. We train them younger and start them harder and run them through more varied environments earlier than we used to. The ones coming up now are better at this than my generation was at the same age. Nobody said anything. That's all, I said. Veth Orveth closed his folder with a precise, careful motion. The way you close something when you are trying not to look like you are closing it, carefully. Sovalkern was writing again. The footage on the screen was at the 22-second mark. The flash from the discharge, the door swinging out, the corridor beyond it, leading away from the installation. I had looked at it 4 times already. I looked at it again now, and I thought about what I had thought in that moment. Not in retrospect, not with the clarity that comes from having survived and debriefed and sat in lit rooms answering careful questions for 2 days. What I had thought in the actual moment, in the half-second after the track assembly cracked, and I knew the door was going to move. I had thought, that worked. Next problem, that was all. That was the whole of it. Okoro's shoulder against the base of the door, the bottom edge swinging out, corridor, the relay cluster 12 meters back, still the objective, still the job. 1 working rifle, around through the primary transmission array, around through the backup feed, done. And then the door, and the team, and the extraction and Soletti's arm getting wrapped properly by Rasmus, while I watched the entry corridor for contact, because the engagement wasn't over until we were clear. And the engagement isn't ever really over until you're somewhere genuinely safe. In 14 years of field service is a standard I have applied with some flexibility. I thought about Sovalkern's description of the protocol floor, the latency gap, the time it takes to disengage from the failed approach and begin constructing an alternative. I thought, I don't know what that feels like. I have never experienced a moment where a situation broke and I did not immediately begin working with what was available. I don't know if that's because I was trained well, or because I was selected for it, or because I'm just built that way, or because we all are, and I've simply never had occasion to notice it until someone put me in a room and asked me to describe it carefully. And I thought about something else. Something Sovalkern had said I fightled away and not responded to in the moment, because the moment hadn't seemed to call for it. But that had been sitting in the back of my mind for the last hour. Humans are drawn to difficulty and complexity. I rolled that around for a while. He was right, and he was describing something that I had never thought to name before. The same way I had never thought to name the improvisation process. Do seek it out. Put a human being in a stable, predictable environment with no novel problems to solve, and something happens to them. Not a dramatic something. A slow grinding something. The word we use for it is boredom, but that word doesn't do it justice. It's closer to the feeling a tool gets. If tools could feel, when they're not being used for the purpose they were made for. A kind of ambient wrongness. A pressure without a direction to push against. Give that same person a genuinely difficult problem. One with no clear solution, no established protocol, no guarantee of success. And the opposite thing happens. The pressure finds its direction. The whole system comes online. I had spent 14 years in situations where the plan broke constantly, and the problems were always novel, and the only certainty was that you'd have to build your way out of whatever the day decided to be. And I had never, not once, wished it were otherwise. Simpler, sometimes. Safer, frequently. But not fewer problems. Never fewer problems. I wondered if the Alliance analysts had thought carefully enough about that part of the data. Not just the capability, but the motivation. A species that is functionally better under novel problem conditions than under stable ones. A species that does not decline with experience in the way their models predicted, because the experience is not wearing the system down. It is building the system up, one solved problem at a time, and the system was designed from the beginning to grow rather than diminish. I thought about what Veth Orveth had said, so there is no ceiling, and I thought about the honest answer, which was, no, there is no ceiling, and also, we have been at this for 61 years by your count. but several orders of magnitude longer than that by ours, because the library doesn't start military service, and it didn't start at my parents' generation, or their parents before them. It started when the first human being picked up a rock and looked at it and thought, this could be something else. It started when the first fire went out, and someone figured out how to make another one from what was at hand. Started so long ago, and has been running continuously ever since, across every individual in the species, in every domain, in every environment, building and cross-referencing, and deepening, that by the time you observed us for the first time, 61 years ago, you were observing the product of an improvisational library so old and so deep that calling it a training program would be like calling the ocean a cup of water. I didn't say any of that. I was a gunnery sergeant, not a philosopher. And the debrief was closing, and Sovalkern was already writing his assessment, and would say it better than I could anyway. But I thought it. Veth Orvath asked if we were finished for the day. Sovalkern said he had what he needed from the formal session and would follow up with me, separately, if anything arose from the written analysis. The officers began the particular kind of organized dispersal that looks efficient but is, actually everyone in the room needing a moment before they stand up. Because sitting is easier to maintain composure in than standing when your understanding of a significant problem has just changed underneath you. I waited. I am patient. It costs nothing. When the room had mostly cleared, Sovalkern came around the table to where I was still sitting and stood for a moment without saying anything. This was a different posture from his debrief posture, less structured, more direct, like someone who has concluded the formal interview and is now saying the thing they couldn't put in the record. I want to ask you something off the record, he said. All right. Do you find this, the process I described, the continuous assessment, the improvisation, the problem construction, do you find it exhausting? I thought about this honestly, the way I try to think about honest questions. No, I said. It is cognitively intensive by any measure we have been able to apply. It is. But intensive isn't the same as exhausting. Exhausting implies the process is costing you something you don't want to spend. This doesn't feel that way. It feels like, I paused, looking for the right word, like breathing. It would be more exhausting to stop. Sovalkern was quiet for a moment. 61 years, he said, that is how long the Alliance has been trying to understand you, trying to find the ceiling, the training program, the specialized cohort, the exploit, the thing that, if you pressed it from the right angle, would show the boundary of the capability. And there is no boundary, there is no specialized cohort, there is no exploit. There is a species that has been building an improvisational library for longer than our civilization has been recording its own history, and that library is in every individual, and it grows every day. And the older and more experienced the individual, the deeper and faster it is. And when we put that individual in a partially collapsed alien installation with a countdown, they cannot read. He stopped. They improvise a solution in 22 seconds and describe it as Tuesday. I looked at him. What do you do with that? I asked. It wasn't confrontational. I genuinely wanted to know what a researcher does with a conclusion that big. I write the report, he said. Present it to the assessors. I recommend a formal doctrinal revision, and I start the next phase of research. He picked up his tablet from the seat where he'd left it. Which is, I should be honest with you, considerably more alarming than the question of the protocol floor. I raised an eyebrow. What's the next phase? Understanding the collective version of this, he said. Individual improvisation under pressure is one data set. What happens when you put multiple humans in a novel situation simultaneously, and they begin sharing their libraries in real time, combining their available underlying logic, building solutions from each other's domains as well as their own? What the output of that looks like at scale, under sustained pressure. He paused. We have some early data. He didn't say what the early data looked like. The way he said it, the care with which he did not say it, told me enough. Good luck with the report, I said. Thank you, he said, and he meant it, and he left. I sat in the quiet room for a moment. The footage had stopped cycling at some point in the last few minutes. Someone finally turned it off, and the screen was dark. The amber status light on the recording equipment was dark too. The room smelled of recycled air and polished surfaces, and the faint chemical undertone that I had come to associate with karath-venn facilities over the past 2 days. Clean, ordered, efficient. I stood up, and on the way to the door I noted the structural details of the room, the wall, position, the panel spacing, the ventilation routing, the single emergency exit behind the equipment rack. Not because I intended to use any of, because I couldn't help it, and never had been able to help it, and had stopped trying to control it roughly a decade ago. The corridor outside was clean and brightly lit and smelled of recycled air and whatever they used in karath-venn facilities to keep the floors polished. It was a very different corridor from the one on the screen. No smoke, no particulate, no countdown I couldn't read. Just a long, lit hallway leading somewhere. I looked at it for a moment, the way you look at any new environment when you arrive in it. I noted the exits, the junctions, the material composition of the walls and what they were likely rated for, the spacing of the lighting panels and what their removal would mean for visibility in different zones, the ventilation grates and their accessible faces, the foot traffic patterns implied by the wear on the flooring, the power routing visible at the corners where the ceiling met the walls, and what those bundles contained and how they were regulated, and what you could do with them if you needed to do something. I didn't decide to do any of that. I just did it. And then I walked toward the far end of the corridor, because that was where they'd told me my quarters were. And there was nothing to solve here. No problem in front of me, no countdown decreasing, and the library could sit quietly all for a while. It would have plenty of time to grow.